kind introduction. And members of the ASU community, thank you very much for your very gracious welcome this evening. Admittedly, I am gratified and grateful and delighted to see such a turnout. I've been wondering as I stood over at the side whether my reputation has preceded me or whether professors have given an awful lot of extra credit to the students who have been very kind and shown up this evening. For those folks in the back, by all means, please come on up to the front. There are quite a few open seats, and it's bad enough that you have to listen to me for a while. It's even worse if you have to do it while you're standing. Please come on up. Thank you so much, Dr. Rollo, President Rollo, Robert in particular. I'm so grateful for the tremendous effort that you have put into this visit. It has been a delight and a privilege for me to come up the road, finally, from Austin. And I drove in yesterday, flew into Austin, drove in yesterday. Born and raised in Austin, but I've never had the privilege of visiting your fair city and this great campus. And I'm honored to do so this evening. I want to do a few things this evening. As Dr. Garza mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about public diplomacy, and I want to talk about that. But first, let me also note that while I am a Foreign Service officer and also an elected member of the American Foreign Service Association Governing Board, my comments tonight are made in a personal capacity, not in an official capacity. And that allows me to be more candid and tell you what I really think about some of these issues in a way that I think very much befits this distinguished academic setting. So with that context, and saying as well that I am honored to be a part of ASU's Holland-Harrell Foreign Affairs Speaking Program, let me now tell you a little bit about what I would like to talk about this evening, and then move into the subject matter per se. You'll note that there's a microphone here in the middle of the room. It is my full intention to hopefully have the opportunity to hear from you, your questions, your comments, and I plan to go until about 7:59 so that we have a full minute to do that at the end. But what I would like to talk about this evening is a topic that is very important to me, and that is public diplomacy. And I want to raise what I think are some tough and I think some probing questions about public diplomacy. Questions that sometimes are not asked enough or even not asked in Washington, D.C. Now, I work, as Dr. Garza mentioned, as the Deputy Executive Director and Senior Advisor of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. It's a bit of a tongue twister. In that capacity, I have really had the opportunity and the privilege of being able to really delve into the topic of public diplomacy. And over this last year or so, year and a half, I have had some new ideas and new thinking about this topic that have been a direct result of my time on this presidential commission as a staff member. So what I want to do this evening is start by putting out some basic ideas about public diplomacy. And then on that basis, talking a little bit about these tough questions that I've just mentioned. Well, first of all, I think it makes sense to start with the question, what is public diplomacy? People know what public is and what diplomacy is, but the term public diplomacy is kind of a specialized term that I think is not used a lot, frankly, outside of Washington. And by public diplomacy, what we are really talking about is, in this case, the United States government's efforts to understand and inform and influence foreign public opinion about the United States in support of our foreign policy objectives. I think there are basically two components to public diplomacy. One is policy advocacy, which is basically the press component. It's the spokespersoning function. It's essentially the United States' attempt to make a case that we're right about this particular issue, and here's why. And we'd like to persuade foreign publics that that is so. The second basic element of public diplomacy is exchange programs. And I think many of you are familiar with the types of exchanges that I'm talking about. I think everybody's heard of the Fulbright exchange program that brings professors from foreign countries here and that brings American professors overseas, and same for students and other scholars. Humphrey Fellowship Program, international visitors, youth exchange, and a whole long list that I could go through. But those exchanges constitute what I would call the sort of big wheel of public diplomacy that keeps turning year in and year out, and that is not dependent on what is in the headlines that particular day in the Washington Post or in the Rampage. And so those are the two aspects of public diplomacy that I'll be speaking about tonight. Note that, in a sense, those two elements of public diplomacy take on two very different issues, or issue clusters. One is U.S. policy, and I think the advocacy function that I mentioned at first is essentially an attempt to help people understand our policies better. The exchanges function is really more geared to helping people overseas understand our country, understand our society, our culture, and the values that underpin those things. It should be noted, I think, I should note that although we are, of course, in the post-9/11 context, and we sometimes talk about public diplomacy, at least some people do, in Washington, as if it were, quote, American outreach to the Muslim world. But that is a subset of public diplomacy, not the whole of it. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what I'm talking about is America's efforts to reach out not just to any one community, but to the world itself. Now, public diplomacy is of increasing importance. And in fact, today is of great importance in the context of U.S. foreign policy. Perhaps today to a greater degree than was ever the case in history. That is because I think we have come to understand as a nation that how the world views the United States matters. It's important. We ought to care about it, and we ought to do our level best to make sure that people understand the United States accurately, whether or not they like us, whether or not they support our particular positions, that this is an important undertaking. And I believe that in the latter years of President Bush's administration and today in the Obama administration, I think our presidents and our government understand the importance of this issue. Now, in my talk this evening, I want to point out that some of the things that I'm going to say kind of defy the conventional wisdom about public diplomacy. There is kind of a set way of thinking about things. There are assumptions that are often unchallenged. And I want to, in fact, ask some tough questions about public diplomacy. Questions that aren't often asked, and the answers to which aren't often thought about. A lot of folks reflexively tend to think, well, public diplomacy is important. We need more people doing it. Exchanges work well. We need to do more of them. The current difficulties are associated with the post-9/11 context and a lot of other different assumptions. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about some of those ideas and pose, again, some probing questions about public diplomacy that I hope will spark some really interesting discussion this evening. So let me start. When we talk about public diplomacy in the context of U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the post-9/11 context, The question that is often posed, which is kind of the basic question of public diplomacy, is, quote, why do they hate us? Why do they hate us? Have you all heard that question asked in this context? A lot of people ask that question. And it occurs to me as I think about public diplomacy that to ask that question is to take as a given that people hate us. And what I want to do is explore some of these notions. So my first question, of my tough or probing questions about public diplomacy is, do they hate us? Let's start with that. I think what I want to do this evening is go through some of these questions without necessarily attempting to answer them all. I'll share some thoughts, certainly. But really what I think of my role as being this evening is to raise some questions that I hope will get people thinking, and not necessarily try to give, quote, a right or wrong answer, or any answer. But in that spirit, let's talk about this question, do they hate us? Well, I think there are four constituent parts to that question. Do they hate and us? Now, why do I separate it out that way? Because in that little four-word short question, it has maybe 15 letters in the whole thing, there are actually some very distinct concepts. Do. Well, that's talking about right now. It's not did, and it's not will. It's what's happening right now. But what I would say is, we shouldn't just care about right now. We need to look at the past and understand where we've come from, why we are where we are today, and perhaps most importantly, think about where we need to be. And so the question do implies now. Do they hate us? Do implies now. But that's not the only temporal element of the question that we need to look at. They. Who are we talking about when we say they? That's an interesting question. Are we talking about foreign governments? Or are we talking about foreign publics? If we're talking about foreign publics, are we talking about elites, trendsetters, opinion shapers, newspaper editors, talking heads, professors, government officials? Or are we talking about the average person on the streets of Moscow or Beijing or Mexico City? And so we need to focus on that question. To answer the question, or even to ask the question, why do they hate us, we have to clarify who we're talking about. Now, what about the word hate? Well, what does that mean? Does that mean really disagreeing with U.S. foreign policy? Or does it mean they really do hate the United States and the American people? Or some aspect thereof? I would argue that when we talk about why do they hate us, what we're really asking is, why do a certain set of people strongly disagree with U.S. foreign policy? And I think that's what we mean, but we sometimes ask that question in a kind of shorthand, and that sometimes leads us to the wrong answer, because we're not asking the right question. And fourth, us. Do they hate us? Why do they hate us? Who is the us? Is the us the U.S. government? Is the us the American people? Is the us some collective sense of our nation, the United States of America, as an American society? Is it pop culture? Is it Britney Spears? Or who is it exactly? Who's the us? Well, those are the questions I think we have to set to talk about this topic. That's my first question. I don't delve into all the answers, but I at least raise this point. Now, let's say that, quote, they do hate us, having discussed that question. Well, the second question, in my mind, is, well then, why do they hate us? Or to put it differently, why do segments of foreign publics have a problem with the United States? Well, I think when we talk about that, we again have to ask ourselves, are we looking at this agreement with U.S. policy, or are we looking at American society more broadly? In either case, I think there is a certain criticism that emerges that is kind of the standard criticism overseas that you often hear. And again, I served in China and in Russia for 5 years and 4 years respectively, 9 years of my career overseas, many other trips as well of a shorter duration. And particularly in those countries, you really get a feel for what the criticisms of our country are. Because these are not places where folks are going to be shy about telling you what they think, to put it mildly. I've had the opportunity and the joy of standing on a podium like this in front of a similar number of folks from China and Russia. And let me tell you, that made for some very interesting interaction. But in terms of the critique, let me lay out what I think are the broad contours of it. Basically, I think there are a lot of folks out in the world that criticize the United States as being arrogant. Arrogant. We kind of throw our weight around. We think we're better than everybody else. That's the criticism. A lot of people criticize the United States for being the sort of self-appointed world policeman. There's a problem in the world, we're the Ghostbusters. We're the ones that go out and deal with it. We've appointed ourselves to that role. Now, people in other parts of the world pose the question, well, who gave you the authority to do that? On what basis? On what legal basis? On what moral basis do you, the United States, go out and tell the world what to do and use your military to do this, that, or the other thing? And so that heavy-handedness, that sense of kind of policing the world, this arrogance, this sort of hegemonistic approach to the world, these are very significant criticisms. Another criticism you often hear is that we in the United States really don't care a lot about what other people think. We kind of do it our way. And we don't pay a lot of heed to whether that is popular or what other countries think, including our own treaty allies, let alone others. And so there is a kind of a unilateralist approach that the United States seems to typify in the mind of many of our foreign critics. Now, these are some of the sort of basic concepts that are out there. There's another criticism, which I think is probably the least damning as a criticism, which is that you, the United States, this is in the words of the foreign critic, you tend to think that, whatever you do, people are going to see your actions in the way that you have often characterized them, with these lofty ideals of non-negotiable demands of human dignity, of human rights, and freedom, and democracy. The words that we all get goosebumps when we hear the U.S. president talk about. But the fact is, according to the criticism, the fact is you're really just in it for cold geopolitical interests. You talk about democracy, but really it's about oil. You talk about the non-negotiable demands of human dignity, human rights, and yet, in the end, it's all about your interests, isn't it? That's the criticism. These are the things that I've heard many times over, including from people who I know, respect, and like, and who like me. At least I think they like me. But these are the contours of the criticism that is out there. Now, that goes to the question of, quote, why do they hate us, again, with the caveat, these are the terms. Here's the third question. The terms that we've talked about in terms of the criticism of the United States are perhaps subjective, perhaps they're a little harsh, but an interesting question just to throw out for all of us to think about which of these criticisms, if any, are accurate, or are they inaccurate? Do we try to police the world? Do we throw our weight around? Or is there any fairness to any of these kinds of criticisms? That's a tough question for any people to ask itself. But there's no better place to ask a question like that than the United States of America, because we're pretty straight shooters with ourselves. As I often point out to my foreign friends, if you want to criticize, and this was back when I was overseas under President Bush, if you want to criticize President Bush, feel free. You'll never criticize him as harshly as American newspapers, because that's our ethic. We believe that you ought to have the right to speak your mind, whether one agrees or disagrees. We are free to disagree in this country. That's a powerful message for a lot of places, a lot of folks in a lot of places where that's not always true. But I think we ought to think about, why are people saying these things about the United States? What is it that is causing a lot of publics, as Dr. Garza mentioned in his introduction, to take these negative views of our nation when they are so clearly at odds with what most of us conceive of as the United States and what we see? Now, the fourth question I want to ask, and this is sort of the last one of the first cluster, is if folks view the United States negatively overseas, does it matter? Does it matter to us? Now, one can make the case that it does. It seems to me one could also make the case that it really doesn't. Because in the final analysis, we, the United States, have an awful lot of power. And we, in fact, are able, as the world's only superpower, to do a lot of things, irrespective of whether people like it or not. That's just the reality. Whether that is good or bad is another question. But that is the reality. So, does it matter if people don't like us? And if it does, why? And I think the basic idea is, I think it does matter. I think there are times, particular cases, where maybe it doesn't. But there are times, more of them, when it does matter. When we have to really concern ourselves with how we're viewed. Because to the extent that anti-Americanism becomes very acute, it starts to take a toll on our alliances and our friendships. It starts to take a toll on our ability to work with other nations to accomplish our national objectives. It starts to, quite frankly, endanger Americans overseas, which is perhaps the most compelling reason why anti-Americanism does matter. And the fact is, when we're not well regarded in the world, those of us who are overseas are just a little bit unsafer, less safe than we were if our nation was regarded as we all think it ought to be and deserves to be. And so I think it does matter, but I think we have to articulate why it matters. Now, with that, I want to go to the second cluster of questions, which I think is actually very interesting. In many cases, in fact, these are questions that are really not often posed. And I think that we as a nation, and certainly we who are working on these issues in the foreign affairs community, need to be more rigorous in asking the questions and in seeking to answer them. And so the first question in this cluster is, all right, we've laid out some of the big topics just now. Well, let's ask ourselves, and this is question number 5, how are we doing in addressing these negative views? If there are negative views out there, which I think we can all agree there are, Dr. Garza mentioned some of the polling data, it's very clear we are not at a high point in terms of how our nation is viewed overseas. That's clear. Probably near a low point. Well, how are we doing in addressing that? Are we succeeding or are we failing? Now, this goes to a very basic question. What is the objective of U.S. public diplomacy? What are we trying to do? We talked about public diplomacy. It's the idea of understanding and informing and influencing foreign public opinion in support of U.S. foreign policy objectives. Well, how are we doing? What is the specific benchmark against which we measure our effectiveness? Now that's a big question, and it relates to the next question that I want to ask, which is question number 6. I want to spend a few minutes on this, which is, what is our desired end state? What is the promised land in terms of public diplomacy? Do we want, for example, foreign publics to like us? If so, how much? Do we want foreign publics, whether or not they like us, to at least agree with our foreign policies? If so, to what degree? And how do we reconcile the notion of perhaps wanting foreign publics to agree with our policies when, in some cases, the American public itself doesn't agree with the foreign policy? Iraq, of course, is a case in point. The great majority of the American people for several years have not embraced the U.S. government's position on Iraq. Now, it raises an interesting question. If we can't convince the American people that this is the right thing to do, how in the dickens are we going to convince the French, the Chinese, the Mexicans, the Russians, or anybody else? We don't talk about that. But I think we need to talk about that and pose the question and get some answers to it. Now let me go back to the question of the desired end state, which is, again, what does success or failure look like? And very candidly, I would suggest that one of the problems in U.S. public diplomacy today, and let me make a parenthetical point here, the commission that I work for, that was mentioned up there a little while ago, the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, is kind of paid to be, that's a commission that was created by Congress in 1948. It's re-upped every couple of years with congressional authorizations. The 7 commissioners report to the President. They report their findings also to the Secretary of State and Congress. I report to them. And our job is to be a gadfly, if you will, and to ask the tough questions and, frankly, to make recommendations for improvement. And so everything that I say is very much in that spirit, even if I'm not necessarily speaking for that commission right now. But we have to ask, what does success or failure look like? And I would argue that we don't know. We haven't thought about the question. We, those who are doing this, I'm pointing the finger at myself. We haven't thought about the question sufficiently rigorously. Although I'm posing it and I'm talking to people about it. But we as a government just haven't done a good job of this. We need to do a better job. The way I often put the question to senior folks in the government in Washington and others, I would say, let's say, for example, that we have done public diplomacy perfectly over the last 10 years. What would the headlines be in the paper today? What would the world look like today if, hypothetically, we had done a perfect job, however that is defined? And I must confess, I don't get satisfying answers to that question because we don't really know. Now this leads to the next question, which I think is a fascinating one. And I'll admit to some creativity and originality on this point. This is a question I don't think anyone else has ever asked. I've asked it a couple of times in talks that I've done. And I ask it in the halls of the State Department. But I think it's something we have to come to terms with if we're really going to speak meaningfully about public diplomacy. Here's the question. What is the culminating act in public diplomacy? Public diplomacy is about communication. Communication can and should be a purposeful thing. Let me here draw a comparison with the political side of the communication discipline and also with the business side. I've studied and taught U.S. politics, and I'm fascinated by it. in political communication, there is a culminating act. The culminating act is the American voter getting off their backside, walking across the street to the elementary school, walking into that booth, and touching the screen or pulling the lever for the candidate who has convinced them that he or she is the right candidate for that job. When you as a candidate have accomplished that, you have succeeded in your communication efforts. That is the culminating act. That is how we can judge whether a candidate has been more or less successful. Barack Obama was the more successful presidential candidate because he had more electoral votes. And those electoral votes were a function of more people getting across the street and pulling that lever. That's how you measure a win and a loss in politics, in political communication. In business, there is a culminating act. It is the customer driving that car down to the Walmart or to the Bells or Sears or any other store and making a purchase of a product. They could have chosen the one to the left or to the right, but they chose the one in the middle. And you, the company, have succeeded. You've done your job. You've communicated purposefully and you got the result. And you measure communication effectiveness in the bottom line. There is a way to measure it. And so the question I ask is, what is the culminating act in public diplomacy? What is the culminating act in public diplomacy? It's not a vote. We're not running for homecoming king, prom queen. It's not a purchase. People are going to buy a Britney Spears CD or whatever American product because they want to buy it. That's not what public diplomacy is about. If we do our jobs perfectly, what is it that happens on the other end of it? And my friends, I'm not sure I have an answer to that question. But I'll say this. At least I'm asking. And I don't think and I'm pointing again the finger at myself, we don't have a handle on it, and we need to. And if we're going to think about public diplomacy more rigorously and with the seriousness that this important topic deserves, then we've got to get a handle on what that culminating act is. What is the thing that happens when we've done our job well? Let me go to the next one. This is, I think, the last question in this cluster, and I'm over the halfway mark in my questions. Then I'll go into my second 3-hour presentation right after that. You think I'm joking? How do we measure and evaluate the effectiveness or course correct as we need to in public diplomacy? Given that we don't know what the culminating act is, we don't really know what success looks like. We're doing the right kinds of things, our heart's in the right place, but we lack a rigorous methodology to really gauge the effectiveness. Are we, again, succeeding or not? What is the metric? What is the measure? And that's something that we are beginning to think about in the context of the foreign affairs community. But I don't think that we have yet really found a totally satisfying answer. Let me give you an example. Let's say that we have a vice mayor from a mid-sized Russian city coming on a U.S. government exchange program to the United States. Let's say they even come to the beautiful city of San Angelo, among others. And they meet with the mayor, the vice mayor, and others, and they come to this great university, and they talk to folks. And they have really learned a lot about the United States and Texas in this process. They go back. They're excited. They're energized. Let's say that vice mayor then writes an article in the local newspaper and says, hey, I went to San Angelo. It's the greatest city in the United States of America. I learned some things that I hadn't thought about. Hey, I've got a couple of new ideas. This is great. article's published. Let's say people read it, they like it. All right, let's say all of that happens. And here's the question. All right, the mayor came, the mayor went back. The article appeared in the newspaper. We can quantify that. 473 words appeared on February 9th. We can quantify how many people read the article because we know the circulation of the newspaper. We may be able to tell that they liked or didn't like it, perhaps from letters to the editor that might follow. But what difference did it make? We can measure those things, but it's hard to pin down the last bottom line difference. It may be possible, but it requires rigorous and methodical follow-up, and we have to ask, well, gee, the mayor saw this new urban policy idea in San Angelo. Now guess what? He's doing it. It's made a difference in the quality of governance in the city. This great experience was attributed to a U.S. program. Good vibes have increased. They've increased by how much? We can maybe measure that. But to do that, you've got to be thinking in measurement terms. You have to have what some would call a culture of measurement, and you've got to stick with it and be rigorous and persistent to try to find that information out. I don't think we're doing all that we should be doing. Part of it may be a resources issue, because to do all this stuff, you need resources. But it is important that we measure, because by measuring, we know what is working and what is not. And we can then allocate resources to those programs that are working and take resources from those programs that don't seem to be doing the job, whatever it is that the job is. So that's the kind of discussion that we're starting to have, but that has frankly emerged late in our nation's public diplomacy efforts. But we're getting better. Let me go to the third main cluster and then I'll conclude. There's a couple more questions and they're pretty quick. If, in fact, there is a problem or problems with our government's public diplomacy programs and operations, let's say that there is. Let's say there are things we can do better. And in fairness, let's say there are things we're doing quite well. But let's say that there are problems, we grant that. Then the question is, how do we fix those problems? And that's what I want to, the last few questions I want to ask pertains to that. Part of it is, well, what are the problems? That's going to tell you how you go about fixing them. Well, what are the problems? Let me list a couple of things. Is the problem our policy or policies? Is that why we have these negative perceptions of the United States? If so, do we or do we not then alter the policies in order to attain, to put it crassly, higher favorability ratings? To put it another way, is public diplomacy, or more specifically, favorable public opinion toward the United States, a legitimate and worthy public foreign policy goal unto itself, or not? If it is, then one could at least intellectually make the case that there may be a time when I can just hypothetically imagine, I have not sat in one of these meetings, but a bunch of folks are sitting with the president, maybe in the Oval Office or in the cabinet room, and they're talking about, should we do this or should we do that? The Secretary of Defense says his piece, the Secretary of State says her piece, the Vice President weighs in, and National Security Advisor and other players and whatever the issue is. Is one of the calculations, Mr. President, if we do this, yes, we'll solve one problem, but we will see a major deterioration in our moral credibility as a nation. And therefore, Mr. President, I don't think the benefit is worth the cost. I'm not sure, and again, I have not sat in meetings at that level, but I'm not sure that that type of discussion is occurring right now. I'm not sure we're really doing a cost-benefit analysis that takes into consideration the desirability of having favorable views of the United States of America, for the reasons that I touched on earlier. But shouldn't we be doing it? Shouldn't that be a consideration? Not the only one, maybe not the overarching or driving one, or the decisive one, but shouldn't it be a question that somebody at that table asks? Now, my hunch is we're not asking. My hunch is, again, my personal opinion and my hunch, is that we're saying, let's do it. Okay, now let's figure out how to sell it. Now, my contention would be, and I think others would agree, we need to ask, should we do it? Here's the pros and here's the cons. And one of the pros or cons is the positive or the negative impact that this decision will have on the United States. Moral credibility, moral authority, reputation, standing, credibility. All of these are important things. They're intangible, but they're real, and they're what national character and national reputation are made of. And that's where we're at a relative low point today. I think it's a legitimate consideration. I think we've got to look at it. The second thing, again, going to the question of, well, if there's a problem, how do we fix it? Well, what about the messaging process? How does the United States government come up with a message to get out to the world in support of a particular foreign policy? Well, let me back up a step. Do we have a messaging process by which we develop a message that goes out to the world? Now let me go back over to my favorite arena, politics. Well, guess what? Any successful candidate, whether it is for city council, for state rep, for Congress, for Senate, for president, anyone that runs for office that is serious and that is in a contested campaign knows that you have to do certain things when you communicate. First of all, you've got to gauge your voters. What do they think? Here's an issue. What do they think about this issue? I know what I think, I, the candidate. How do I couch my views in a way that resonates with this audience? Do I talk about this issue? If I'm for it and 74% of my district is against it, okay, I'm not going to cave in and flip-flop, but maybe I don't talk about that issue and make that the highlight of my campaign because it will kill me on election day. So I don't do that. Instead, I know that my view on this other issue has 89% support, and guess what? Coincidence, that's going to be the core of my campaign. Well, that's what you do. You don't flip-flop. Mostly, you shouldn't flip-flop. Some do. But you at least ask the question, what's going to work in terms of a campaign? I'll be true to myself, but let me also be smart about how I sell and package my ideas. Package and sell. Maybe better than that one. Now, anyone running for city council knows how to do that. But the thing that I was shocked to learn some years ago, and I, to be very honest, spoke out about it at the time. And frankly, it wasn't particularly appreciated for doing so, if I can put it euphemistically. We're not doing that. We don't have, in most cases, a baseline understanding of what the public in country X or country Y thinks about the issue that we bring into our messaging process, our message development process, so that we can tailor the message to the particular environment and know 42% of women between 30 and 40 with a college education think this about it, and they react very well to this way of framing the question. But 94% of men in this demographic and so forth don't like this, and therefore we shouldn't reach out to that group because that group is a lost cause. Let's not waste the precious resources. Let's put the resources where we can make a difference, etc., etc. Anyone that's run for city council understands all that. We haven't applied that rigor to our national communications in the field of public diplomacy. The way I would put it in summary form is we communicate as if there weren't a bottom line. That's a problem. It's a problem that I've called attention to. Now others are starting to. And I will say, I was early on in this. 1999, I first raised this issue at a meeting, conference that we had in Moscow. And suffice it to say that it's taken a while. But now we're seeing some movement in the direction of, let's figure out what people think, let's figure out where we can make a difference, let's marshal our precious resources and scarce resources in that battle, and not waste resources on a fight we cannot win. It's the old logic. That's why Dennis Kucinich didn't open up a campaign office in San Angelo, Texas. Right? Because it wouldn't make a heck of a lot of sense for him to do that. It's why McCain didn't contest Massachusetts, Obama didn't contest Mississippi, or to a certain degree Texas, although that was closer than expected. The point being, you don't go into a place where you know you can't win, because it's a waste. Okay, we need to apply that same rigor to this. That's the messaging process. Maybe that's the problem. Third point, what about funding? Do we have enough funding for public diplomacy? Let me give you an interesting statistic. It's a rough but generally accurate statistic. If you take the budget of the U.S. military in its sort of full splendor and glory, not just DOD, which is over $500 billion a year today, but also, let's say, Department of Veterans Affairs, which is taking care of those who have taken care of us. We all know that's the right thing to do. There's a cost associated with it. Let's group that in, taking care of our veterans. What about Department of Energy nuclear weapons programs? What about the other things? You add all of those costs up that are sort of straight DOD and auxiliary costs, and we spend about $1 trillion a year on our military. $1 trillion. How much do we spend on public diplomacy, which is the thing that's supposed to stop us from ever having to use our military in the first place? We spend about $1 billion. Well, the math is, $1 trillion is 1,000 times more than $1 billion. Now, we need and must have an extraordinary and powerful military in this country. We all understand that. But wouldn't it make sense, perhaps, to spend maybe $2 billion on public diplomacy? Maybe $3 billion. Maybe let's splurge and spend $5 billion. The point being that there is an enormous disparity in the resources we devote to hard power and the resources we devote to the subset of soft power that is called public diplomacy. And maybe we need to get that in sync. Maybe, I'm just throwing it out there as a thought, I don't even necessarily know if it's the right number, maybe instead of 1,000 to 1, it ought to be 750 to 1, 500 to 1. Maybe there needs to be additional importance attached to the funding. So the funding is a question that we need to look at, but I will link it back to the basic point that I made. How are we doing? Are we succeeding? First, we have to get a handle on that question. Because if what we're doing isn't working, then spending more money doing it isn't going to get us very far. But if what we're doing is working, then spending more money doing it may well be a pretty smart thing to do. So all these questions are kind of interconnected and related. Last point I would make just briefly. Our commission did a report in June of last year, came out in June, called Getting the People Part Right. A report on the human resources dimension of U.S. public diplomacy. And what we basically contended in that report, which I think is a very good report and which sparked congressional hearings on this topic for the first time in history. So it got some attention. The report said, we need to do a better job recruiting the right people. We need to do a better job examining them in terms of the Foreign Service exam. and test for the right skills. We need to do a better job training them. I'm talking about public diplomacy folks, because they're not getting the training that they need, not all of the training that they need to go out and be effective. We also need to do a better job of evaluating them on the right tasks. That's a positive way of saying we're recruiting the wrong people, testing them on the wrong skills, then we're training them in the wrong areas and evaluating them on the wrong tasks. Now, it's pretty rare that a government report comes out and says something like that. But we did. And the Senate looked at it and said, that's not too good. And so they called hearings on it back in September. Joe Lieberman's Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. We testified before the committee, we the commission, not myself, although I was involved in the preparation of the testimony. And now there's some attention being paid to the decision. We also said there's some things we need to do to get the structure right. I won't delve into the boring details of that. Suffice it to say, there are some internal bureaucratic or structural issues that we have to address to be effective in terms of U.S. public diplomacy. So the policy, the messaging process, funding, getting the people part right. Those are the kinds of things that we've got to do if we in fact determine that we're not doing everything that we can and should to communicate purposefully and to communicate as if there is a bottom line, because there is a bottom line. This does matter to our country. Let me conclude with one final point, and then we'll have time for any questions and comments. Many of you are familiar with the writings of Francis Fukuyama and Samuel Huntington. Fukuyama wrote an article and later a book called The End of History and the Last Man. Huntington, a few years later, wrote a book called The Clash of Civilizations. Both were very influential. Both continue to appear in the discourse on U.S. diplomacy and on world affairs. Francis Fukuyama raised the idea with the demise of the Soviet Union, the end of communism in Europe, and the end of the Cold War, that history was over. We had won. We had shown that our national idea is better. Once and for all, beyond any doubt, it is better than the other that was out there, communism. And you know what? We won, they lost, we're still here, they're gone, and history is over. There is no more debate about what the right way to organize society is. That was his argument. Pretty persuasive and compelling as we watch the Berlin Wall crumble. Well, a few years later, we found ourselves in some pretty tough neighborhoods in the world. And we realized that there's still a little bit of history out there that we haven't quite got to the end of. Samuel Huntington wrote a very influential piece called The Clash of Civilizations, and made the point that, no, history is not over. There are 8 profoundly distinct civilizational segments out there in the world, where you can draw lines across Western Europe, South America, North America, Africa is in its own category, East Asia, Oceania, South Asia is in its own cultural zone, civilizational zone. And these 8 zones are going to go at it pretty good, whether in trade, whether in commerce, whether in culture. History's not over. Now let me back up and make the point that I want to conclude with. Our public diplomacy is predicated on a premise that basically is I would argue, a Cold War premise. And that is, if we could just talk to those guys, if we just had 5 minutes in the room with them, whoever them is, we could convince them that we've got it right, that democracy is the right way to run a country, that market economics is the right way to deliver prosperity to your people the way we've delivered it to ours. If we could just talk to them, they would see that we're right. That is a Francis Fukuyama end of history supposition. The question is, does a Francis Fukuyama construct, an end of history construct, still make sense in a clash of civilizations world? That, I think, is a pretty profound and significant question that we really need to think about. It may be that if we could just sit down and talk to that Chinese professor or editorial writer, or the Russian, or the Mexican, or anyone else in the world, it may be that we could talk to them for a pretty good while over some sweet tea. And they may not come away from that liking us any better, or understanding us, or agreeing with us necessarily anymore. They may understand us, and they may just not agree, and they may just not like us. If that is the case, then we need to go back and reevaluate the fundamental premise of our entire public diplomacy operation. We need to ask ourselves the question, is it worth it? Even the $1 billion that we're spending on it. Now the answer may be, yes it is. The answer may be maybe it's worth a little more. The answer may be it is worth a little less. But we've got to tie that into an analysis of what it is we're trying to accomplish, and whether our basic premise in public diplomacy communication makes sense and conforms to the tested, field-tested knowledge base, knowledge set that is out there about what constitutes effective communication. That's a long-winded way of saying we need to be more rigorous and figure these questions out and get our public diplomacy right so that we can advance our nation's interests. And with that, I'd like to conclude by thanking all of you for doing what I would rarely wish on anybody, and listening to me talk for about an hour. And I would be very, very happy to hear from you, any questions you might have, any comments. And again, thank you for the generous and precious gift of your time. I'm very grateful and looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.